gotten married, was about to become a new father, and he was only 18 years old. While missing his family back home and being lonely, he, like so many others, formed bonds with their fellow comrades. One of the men Danny became very close to was Steve Ike. As Andrew DeKeever says in his book, Here Rests in Honored Glory, which is where many of the facts I'm sharing today comes from, friendships such as that shared between Danny and Steve cannot be emphasized enough. In war, when young men are thousands of miles from their wives, children, and parents, and are forced to confront death, fear, and hardship, the only family they have left to rely on is the person next to them, their buddy. Beyond just being a best friend, buddies take care of each other in the same way that two members of a family would. As they endure the trials of combat together, the men of infantry units can develop bonds between them that in some cases are even stronger than those between family. Just as members of a family would do anything to protect each other, a soldier or Marine would not hesitate to lay down his own life in order to save the life of his buddy in battle. Steve and Danny became good buddies. They got to know each other through their card games, their pranks, and the unknown fears that so many of these young men faced. On the evening of February 28, 1969, Steve and Danny, along with Lance Corporal Ronald Hammonds and Private First Class Stephen Pike Fletcher, assumed their positions in Fire Support Base Tomahawk, which was located in Quang Nam province of South Vietnam. Ike and Hammonds were set up in a two-man fighting position on the northern part of Hill 235, while Danny and Pike was positioned 10 to 15 feet away. Even though the night was clear and bright, their view was somewhat obstructed. They knew they were surrounded, so they were ordered to a 50% security, which meant that one man from the foxhole slept while the other remained alert and watched out for enemy activity. The night was quiet except for the wind. Danny and Ike began their 4-hour guard shift at 10 o'clock that evening. In order to silently signal each other in case of danger, they tied a string through their canteens. Through the next few hours, Hammonds often heard rustling noises in the underbrush, approximately 100 feet to the front. The men didn't know if this was possibly the enemy, just the wind, or maybe some kind of animal. These Marines, however, were under orders not to fire at anything unless they were sure of their targets, so they just waited. These boys were scared and often pulled on their canteen string throughout the night, thinking they heard signs of enemy movement. At 1 a.m., Danny began tugging on his string again. Suddenly, a flare rocketed into the air from outside the perimeter. Danny motioned for Ike to put his head down and pointed toward the brush in front of them. He then heard Vietnamese voices coming from the wood line. Fletcher, who had been off shift and sleeping a few feet behind the foxhole, awoke when he heard Danny say, "Stay down." Fletcher started crawling to their fighting position when he saw Danny stand up and look off to the left of the trail that ran past their foxhole. Suddenly, a satchel containing an explosive was thrown at them from where they had heard the voices. As Fletcher jumped into the foxhole, he heard what sounded like Danny catching a football. Seeing Fletcher enter the foxhole, Danny wrapped himself around the satchel and jumped out of their position. "Get down, Pike," Danny yelled, and he dropped him to the ground, smothering the object with his body. The explosive was so powerful that it collapsed the walls of Fletcher's foxhole. The blast even reached Ike, who was 20 feet away. Hammonds, off shift and sleeping, sprung up when he heard the explosion. He called for Bruce 3 times, and without getting an answer, he ran to Bruce and Fletcher's location. Fletcher did not realize that he had also been wounded until he felt the blood on his leg. The explosion marked the beginning of a fierce firefight that lasted for the next 5 to 7 hours. It was March 1st, 1969, and Danny Bruce had been killed. He was 18 years old. The following day, on March 2nd, his baby daughter was born. Is that the end of Danny's story? No. Because of his heroism and sacrifice, his fellow Marines, Ike, Hammonds, and Fletcher, were saved, and they later approached their sergeant and suggested that Danny be recommended for the Medal of Honor. On February 16, 1971, President Nixon posthumously awarded the medal to Danny's parents. These three men, who each had looked danger and terror in the eye alongside Danny, were forever bonded together by the events of that day. Being a Marine, they each were willing to lay down their own lives in order to save the others. But Danny was the one who was called upon to make the sacrifice that night, and they now each had to live with the result of that and go forward with their lives. They each have had to fight their own personal battles since returning from NAM. Shannon, Ron Hammond's daughter, shared a bit of this in an email. While I am thankful that my father came back from Vietnam, there's so much of him that was lost there that simply could not be recovered. So much that would affect him until he died. There was also something very deep inside of him that held what happened there, and although he didn't share with me the horrors he witnessed, there were times I could almost see the pain in his eyes. There was so much that he refused to forget. But the reason that Danny sacrificed his own life was so that each of these men could live. He knew that any one of them would have done the same thing for him. That's what buddies did. But how do you say thank you to someone for saving your life? Perhaps by living your life fully, being kind to yourself, accepting the gift that he gave you with gratitude and respect, and to share the story of his life. It's really not about the sacrifice, it's about the love. The love he had for his family, the love of his country, the love of his friends, and the love he had for life while he was with us. Share that love, that compassion, and that kindness with the people around you and help make the world a better place. Share his story. We are so pleased to have with us today Steve